That necklace is from the Ashford family. The furious shout echoed through the dining room, cutting off all conversation. Damon Blackwood, the city's most feared man, shot to his feet. His face was a mask of rage as he pointed directly at a young cleaning girl. Ivy froze where she stood, a rag in her hand. The blood ran cold in her veins. She dropped the cloth and her hands flew to her neck, covering the golden locket there. "Sir, I did not steal this," she stammered, taking a small step back. "I swear." Damon ignored her. He kicked a chair out of his way and moved toward her, with the force of a storm. Other guests scrambled to get away, terrified of the anger pouring from a man whose name made criminals quake. "Do not lie to me," Damon growled, trapping her against a stone pillar. "I have looked for that necklace since I was a child. Where did you find it? Tell me." The restaurant manager, Harrison, rushed over, his face red with panic. "Mr. Blackwood, please, be calm." He pushed himself between them, his hands up. "My deepest apologies, sir. This girl is new. She is just a common thief." He spun on Ivy, his voice like ice. "You are fired. Leave now, or I will call the police." Harrison gripped her arm, yanking her toward the kitchens. Ivy cried out, but before she could pull away, a strong hand closed around the manager's wrist. It squeezed until the man's knuckles turned white. It was Damon. "Let her go," he said in a low, deadly voice. "If you touch her again, I promise this restaurant will be gone by morning. And so will you." Harrison instantly let go of her, shaking as he backed away with his hands raised. "But Mr. Blackwood, she has the family crest. Be quiet and get out of my sight." Damon did not look at him again. He turned back to Ivy. They were so close she could smell whiskey on his breath and see the deep pain in his dark eyes. "Give me the necklace." He held out his open hand. "No." Ivy shook her head, clutching the locket. "This belongs to me. It is the only thing my mother ever gave me. I have had it my whole life." "Lies." Damon slammed a fist against the pillar, the sound cracking through the silent hall. Catherine Ashford wore that the night she was killed. No one made it out of that crash alive. Not one person. Ivy was trembling. But a final piece of pride, the kind that belongs to someone with nothing left, gave her strength. Her fingers shook as she unfastened the locket. She held it out to the most powerful man in the city, but she did not give it to him. "If you think I stole it," her voice shook but held steady, "then tell me what is written on the back. If it is your family's, you would know." Damon froze. He could barely breathe. The engraving, his voice went soft, filled with a deep sadness. "It says V and C, forever. Victor and Catherine. Forever." Ivy slowly flipped the locket over. The restaurant lights caught the worn letters on the old gold. V and C. Forever. A choked sound escaped Damon's throat. He snatched the locket from her. His fingers were shaking as he traced the letters again and again, as if checking if they were real. This cannot be possible. He looked up, his eyes boring into hers. "How old are you?" 26. "What is your birthday?" "I do not know the exact day," Ivy answered, rubbing her neck where the locket used to be. "I was found on November 15th. Damon's world came to a halt. November 15th was the night of the ambush. The night he watched, as an 11-year-old boy, while Catherine Ashford's car went over Raven's Peak. It was the night they buried her and the baby everyone thought was with her. But if nobody survived, how was this girl here, wearing a necklace passed only by blood? This piece of gold holds a secret buried for over 2 decades. If you want to find out what really happened that night, hit the like button for this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Share this with a friend who enjoys a good mystery. They will be glad you did. Damon said nothing else. He grabbed Ivy's wrist and pulled her right through the main hall, past all the staring guests. Ivy fought to get her hand back, but the man's grip was like steel. It was impossible to break free. They went down a long hall and stopped at a heavy wooden door. Damon threw it open, pushed her inside, and locked it behind them. The fancy room, with its leather couches and crystal lights, now felt like a prison. Damon turned to two guards in the hall and gave a quiet command. No one enters, and no one leaves. Understood? The two men gave a sharp nod. The door clicked shut. Ivy pressed herself into a corner, her heart beating like a drum. She watched as Damon took out his phone and made a call. His voice was cold. Dr. Hammond, bring a DNA kit to Skyline Restaurant now. VIP room number 3. This is not a request. He hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. I am not your prisoner, Ivy said. Her voice was shaking, but she tried to sound strong. You cannot keep me here. Damon turned to face her. His dark eyes looked like endless pits. You will stay until I have my answer. An answer for what? Ivy demanded. Damon was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. For all the years I have been waiting. Ivy did not know what he meant, but she heard the deep pain in his voice, a pain that had settled into his bones. Damon moved closer. Tell me about your life. Tell me everything. Ivy swallowed hard. I was raised at St. Mary's Orphanage. I have no idea who my parents are. The nuns told me I was left on their doorstep during a bad storm. What else? Damon pushed. Ivy paused. I was wrapped in an old leather jacket. Sister Agatha said it smelled like motor oil and smoke. She saved it for me, but it fell apart over the years. Only the necklace survived. Damon grew still. A leather jacket, the smell of oil. He filed that detail away. It was important. He did not know how yet, but his instincts told him it was a clue he could not lose. 40 minutes later, the door opened. Man in glasses walked in, holding a black case. It was Dr. Hammond, the Ashford family doctor. He did not ask any questions. He took a small blood sample from Ivy and got to work. A thick silence filled the room. Ivy sat on the couch, her hands twisted together. Damon stood by the window with his back to her, looking out at the night. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Then Dr. Hammond spoke. His voice was unsteady. I have the results. Damon spun around. Say it. The doctor looked at the screen, then at Ivy, with an expression of pure disbelief. Her DNA is a 99.97% match to the sample from Catherine Ashford. The world seemed to stop. Ivy felt like the floor had disappeared. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Damon did not move. All these years, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. You were alive. We all thought you were gone. Victor cried every night for you. I searched the entire world for a ghost. Ivy finally found her voice. Who am I? Damon walked over to her. The anger was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by something fierce, like a fire that had been buried for 26 years and was now free. You are Rosalie Ashford, he said, speaking slowly and clearly. The only child of Victor and Catherine Ashford. You are the lost princess of our family. Ivy just shook her head. No, that is impossible. I am an orphan. I clean floors for a living. I am not a princess. Damon did not reply. He turned to Dr. Hammond. Get the cars ready. Then he looked at Ivy with an expression that left no room for argument. She is coming home tonight. A line of 3 black Rolls-Royce cars moved through the dark city streets. Ivy sat next to Damon, staring out the window but seeing nothing. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Rosalie Ashford. The name echoed in her mind, sounding like it belonged to someone in a completely different world. After 20 minutes, the cars reached a massive iron gate. It swung open, and Ivy gasped as she saw the Ashford home. It was not a house, it was a palace. It had tall white columns, bright windows, and a huge garden with a marble fountain. Ivy had only ever known small, cheap rooms. Now she was here. Damon opened her door. Ivy got out on shaky legs. She tried to act calm, but her heart was racing. Damon led her up the steps, through a huge carved oak door, and into a hall with a high ceiling and a sparkling crystal chandelier. This is your home now, Damien told her. It has always been. Before Ivy could find any words, a weak voice called out from down the hall. Is that you, Damien? Bring her to me. They proceeded down a long hallway and paused at the entrance to a large room. Damien opened the door. A frail man was sitting in a wheelchair near the fireplace. He was Victor Ashford, only 68 years old, but he appeared closer to 80. His hair was completely white. His eyes were clouded by time and too many tears. His face was a mask of sharp bones, shaped by a lifetime of sorrow. But the moment he saw the pendant on Ivy's neck, his entire demeanor shifted. A tremor ran through Victor Ashford. His thin hands clenched the wheelchair's arms. Tears filled his tired eyes and traced paths down his weathered face. He struggled to rise, but his legs had lost their strength. Damien moved quickly to support him. Victor approached Ivy with slow, deliberate steps, as if she were a dream that might fade if he moved too quickly. He raised a trembling hand to touch her cheek. His skin felt cool and dry, but the contact held a tenderness she had never known. "My daughter," Victor breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "My Rosalie, you have your mother's eyes, Catherine's eyes." Ivy was frozen, unsure of what to do. She had spent her life dreaming of a family, of hearing someone call her daughter. Now that it was real, she was lost. "I do not know what to say," she managed. "You do not have to say a thing," Victor said, his tears still flowing freely. "Just being here is enough. I have waited for this moment since that terrible night. I believed you were gone forever. I never thought I would see you again." He then pulled her into an embrace. His arms were frail, but his grip was desperate, as if she would vanish if he let go. His whole body shook with sobs. "Catherine!" Victor cried out his wife's name, his voice shattered by grief. "Catherine, our little girl is back. Can you see her? She is finally home." For Ivy, a woman who had never been held, never been called a daughter, it was too much. A lifetime of holding back tears ended as something broke inside her chest. The tears came in a flood. Uncontrollable, she wept for the mother she never met. She wept for the father who had waited for her for more than 25 years. Much later, after they had both composed themselves, Victor sat down again. He refused to let go of her hand. His expression turned serious. "There is something you must know," he said, his voice low. "Your mother's crash was not an accident." Ivy stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about, sir?" Damien moved to stand beside Victor's chair. "It was a planned hit," he stated. "Someone ran Catherine's car off that cliff. They wanted her gone." Victor's grip on Ivy's hand tightened. "The enemies who did this are still out there. I have searched for 26 years without finding them. Now you are here, wearing that token. They will know you survived." A chill went through Ivy's entire body. "So that means—" Victor nodded grimly. "You are in danger," he said, his tone a mix of sorrow and resolve. "But I will not lose you again. I will give my own life to keep you safe." Ivy could not sleep during her first night at the Ashford estate. Her room was bigger than any place she had ever lived, with a large bed covered in silk sheets and heavy velvet curtains. But the opulence brought her no comfort. She tossed for hours, her thoughts a chaotic storm of recent events. Finally, she gave up. She put on a light robe and walked onto the balcony. Blackwood City was a glittering expanse of lights below. The cold night air whipped through her hair. Ivy gripped the railing, staring out at nothing. "You cannot sleep either." The deep, quiet voice startled her. She turned to see Damien leaning in the doorway. He was a figure of light and shadow in the moonlight. "Neither can you," Ivy observed. Damien did not respond immediately. He crossed the balcony to stand next to her, and together they looked out over the city. After a long silence, he spoke. "I was 11 on the night it happened. I was living on the streets, taking what I needed to get by, sleeping in alleys. Then Victor found me. He gave me a home, a family, a purpose. Ivy listened without a word, feeling the immense weight behind his story. That night, the night of the crash, I was in the car right behind Victor's, Damien continued, his voice softer now. We were bringing Catherine home from the hospital. She was 8 months pregnant with you. He paused, his jaw clenching as he fought back the memory. I saw the whole thing, he said. These cars appeared from nowhere. They pushed Catherine's vehicle straight off the road. I saw it fall down the cliff. I saw it erupt in flames. Ivy's chest ached. Damien faced her, his dark eyes like endless voids. I will never forget Victor's screams that night. He screamed Catherine's name. He screamed for his unborn child. He tried to follow her over the edge, and I, a boy of only 11, had to physically restrain him. What happened after that? Ivy asked, her voice a faint whisper. When it was over, I knelt in front of Victor, Damien said. I made a promise. What did you promise? Damien looked directly at her. The moonlight sharpened the angles of his face and the fierce light in his eyes. I promised I would find the people responsible and make them pay. I promised to find the child, if she had survived. I promised I would protect the Ashford family with my own life. He adopted me. He gave me control of his entire empire when I turned 18. I took this position not for the power, but because I needed the power to keep my promise. Ivy looked at him and finally understood. His harshness, the cruel rumors about him, it was all rooted in that single tragic night. Have you found who did it? She asked. Damien was quiet for a long moment. He turned his back to her, a solitary figure against the moon. Not yet, he admitted. They are like ghosts. I have torn this city's underworld apart for years and found nothing. But your return changes everything. How does it change things? Ivy questioned. Damien turned back, his gaze sharp enough to cut. Our enemies will come out of hiding, because you, Rosalie Ashford, are the one thing they cannot ignore. The next few days were a blur that Ivy was not sure she wanted to leave. They treated her like royalty. Servants offered her countless expensive outfits and jewels. Fresh flowers appeared in her room each morning. A personal chef prepared whatever she desired. Every staff member on the estate lowered their head as she passed. But the attention made her feel suffocated, not happy. She was used to fending for herself, to simple food and hard work. This new life felt like an ill-fitting costume. On the third morning, a man entered the sitting room where Ivy was alone. He was around 55, with styled dark hair, a perfect gray suit, and a pleasant smile. Welcome home, Miss Ashford, he said, his voice smooth and calm. I am Marcus Kane, Damien's most trusted advisor. I have been with this family since before you were born. Ivy got to her feet, unsure of how to act. Hello. Marcus came closer with a bouquet of white roses and placed them on a table. A small gift to welcome you, he offered. Damien has a harsh exterior, but he dedicated his adult life to finding you. For over 2 decades, he never stopped looking. You are the only good thing he still believes in. Ivy glanced from the flowers to Marcus. His kindness felt genuine. His smile was warm and his eyes seemed sincere. Thank you, she said. I am still adjusting to all of this. Marcus gave an understanding nod. Of course. This is a lot to take in, but you have no reason to be afraid. We are all here to keep you safe. He then spent the morning showing her around the massive home, explaining the history of each room and telling stories of the Ashfords. His tone was patient and kind. Later that day, another man arrived. Preston Cole, also 55, was a longtime business associate. He had graying hair, a strong jaw, and wore an expensive suit. He saw Ivy in the sitting room, and his face lit up with a brilliant smile. It is a miracle, he declared. Victor's daughter has returned. The Ashford family is truly fortunate. Preston reached out to shake her hand, but as they touched, a deep unease settled over her. His smile was wide, but his eyes held a chilling emptiness. It was there for only a second before it disappeared. "Thank you," Ivy said, forcing her voice to remain even. Preston did not linger. After a short talk with Victor, he left to find Damien. As Ivy walked down the hall, she overheard them speaking. "Are you certain she is who she says she is?" Preston's voice was hushed. "This could be an elaborate trick. DNA can be forged. You need to be cautious. She is Victor's daughter." Damien's voice was like ice. "That token is proof enough." "I only want to ensure the family's safety," Preston insisted. "You know many people would use Catherine's death to try and take over Ashford." Ivy slipped away before they could see her listening. A frantic rhythm pounded in her chest. She was unsure how to feel about Preston Cole. The real disturbance came later that evening. Walking down the east corridor to her room, she found Marcus and Preston in a shadowed corner. They were speaking in low, urgent whispers, their heads bowed close. Ivy could not make out the words, but their expressions were grim. Then Marcus looked up and saw her. His face instantly changed, breaking into that practiced smile. "Miss Ashford," he called out, his voice bright, as if he had been caught doing nothing. "You are up late." Preston turned, offered a curt nod, and then walked off without a word. "Just some business," Marcus explained, seeing the question in her eyes. "Nothing for you to be concerned about. Sleep well." Ivy gave a small nod and returned to her room. But sleep would not come. Something was deeply wrong. She felt the truth of it in her bones. Marcus's smile was too polished. Preston's stare was too cold. And that hushed conversation in the shadows. What was it about? She did not have the answer. But she knew one thing for certain. In this house, not everyone was a friend. In the following days, Ivy confirmed a disturbing fact. Damien was everywhere she went. It was not a coincidence. He followed her like a shadow glued to her feet. If she went down for breakfast, he was already there. If she walked in the garden, he was watching from a balcony. If she went to the library to find a book, he would show up 10 minutes later, claiming he needed to find some documents. It was more than just his presence. Ivy saw that the male servants were slowly disappearing from her part of the estate. Only women remained. When she asked a maid, the young woman looked down and whispered that Mr. Blackwood had all male staff reassigned. No reason was given, but everyone knew why. After a week, Ivy reached her breaking point. She found Damien in his office and threw the door open without knocking. Damien looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers with no surprise. It was as if he expected her. "You are watching me 24 hours a day," Ivy stated, her voice shaking with rage. "I cannot breathe. I cannot go anywhere without a shadow. I cannot speak to anyone without being watched. Is this protection? Or am I your prisoner?" Damien rose from his chair and walked around the desk toward her. "I am protecting you." Ivy let out a bitter laugh. "You have removed every man from my vicinity. You decide who I can see and what I can say. That is not protection. It is an obsession." Damien stopped directly in front of her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You do not understand." His voice was no longer cold but carried a deep, fierce current. "For 26 years, I have lived under that oath. For all those years, I looked for you in total despair. I searched everywhere, walked down every dark alley, and questioned so many people, but there was nothing. Not one clue. I believed you were dead. I thought I had failed my promise to Victor." He raised a hand, his fingers stopping just shy of her cheek. He paused, as if afraid she might vanish at his touch. "Now you are here," he said. "Real. Alive. I will not allow anyone to touch you. No one." "Does that include me deciding my own fate?" Ivy asked, her voice softer but firm. Damien held her gaze. "Even that." They stood in a silent standoff. Neither one backed down. In the end, Ivy broke away first. She left the room with a heart full of conflict. She hated the control, but a small part of her understood his reasons. That understanding made it impossible to truly hate him. That night, nightmares consumed Ivy's sleep. She dreamed of a car flying off a cliff on a stormy night, the shriek of twisting metal, the explosion of glass, a woman's scream, and then fire, an inferno that burned everything. She woke with a jolt, soaked in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sat in bed for a long moment, trying to calm her breathing. Then she got up and went to the door. She needed fresh air. She had to escape that room, if only for a moment. But when she opened the door, she froze. Damien was standing right outside. He was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, his eyes closed, but he was not relaxed. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for action. His eyes snapped open the second the door moved. In the dim hallway, his dark gaze was sharp, but held no threat. "What are you doing here?" Ivy whispered. "Standing watch," Damien replied, his voice flat. "You have dozens of guards. Why do you have to do this?" "Because I trust no one else," he said simply. Ivy swallowed. "You do this every night?" The silence was his answer. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, her tone softening. Damien watched her for a long time before he spoke. His voice was a low, tired sound. "I have not had a peaceful night's sleep since I was 11. Every time I close my eyes, I see that car go off the road. I hear Victor's screams. Now, at least, I have a reason to stay awake. I have someone to protect." Ivy stared at him. This was the most feared man in the city, the Mafia leader who made the underworld quake. And he stood outside her door all night, every night, just to keep her safe. For the very first time, she was not afraid of him. She felt a deep sadness. Sadness for the 11-year-old boy who saw too much. Sadness for the man who carried that weight for more than 20 years. She said nothing more. She went back into her room. But she did not close the door completely. She left it open a crack, letting a thin ribbon of light slice through the darkness of the hall, like an invitation, or a promise that she would not run away. After that night, Ivy could not get him out of her head. Damien standing guard, Preston Cole's cold stare, Marcus Kane's perfect smile, her mother's murder 26 years ago, and a killer who was still free. She could not just wait for others to save her. She needed to know the truth. She would find it herself. 3 nights later, at 2 in the morning, Ivy snuck out of her room. She knew Damien was usually there, but tonight he was in an urgent meeting and had not yet returned. This was her chance. Her bare feet were silent on the cold marble floor. She navigated the dark corridor, dodging the security cameras she had carefully mapped out. The records archive was in the basement. She had found it by accident when Marcus gave her a tour. The door was unlocked. Ivy slipped inside, using the small light from her phone. Metal shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with file boxes like an army of silent witnesses. She started her search, running her fingers over the labels. Business deals, financial records, employee files. Then she saw it. A dusty metal box with a faded label. The incident on November 15th. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a thick file, its pages yellow with time. She began to read, her eyes flying across the pages in the dim light. The report described the scene. It included photos of a charred car at the base of a cliff. The victims were listed. Catherine Ashford, age 32, 8 months pregnant, deceased. The driver was also deceased. The fetus was never recovered and was presumed dead. Ivy felt sick but forced herself to continue. She found a typed page titled Internal Security Analysis. Her eyes grew wide. The report stated that Catherine Ashford's travel plans for November 15th were a closely guarded secret. Only a handful of people knew the exact time and route. A list followed. Victor Ashford, Damien Blackwood, age 11. The private driver, deceased. And one other name. But it was not crossed out. It had been intentionally scraped from the page, leaving a pale, raw mark like a scar. Ivy's heart pounded. Someone had erased their name from this list. Someone who knew Catherine's schedule that night did not want to be found. Who was it? Was this the person who betrayed her mother? She turned the page. It was an additional report. An unidentified witness had been seen near the crash site about 30 minutes after it happened. He was a middle-aged male wearing an old leather jacket and riding an old motorcycle. He appeared to be carrying something as he left. His identity was unknown. The investigation was closed. Ivy froze. The leather jacket. Sister Agatha had told her she was wrapped in an old leather jacket when she was left at the orphanage, the smell of oil and smoke, an old motorcycle. The pieces clicked into place. This man was there. He had taken something from the crash. He had taken her. This man had saved her life. She had to find him. He was the only person alive who knew what happened. At that precise moment, the archive door creaked open. Ivy spun around, shoving the file behind her back. Hallway light flooded the room, outlining a figure in the doorway. It was Marcus Kane. He was dressed in a suit, even at this hour. His hair was perfectly in place, and he wore that familiar, easy smile. But the smile did not touch his eyes. His eyes were like chips of ice. He stood like a shadow in the doorway. Marcus spoke, his voice soft, but an edge in it made Ivy's skin crawl. "It is late, miss. What are you looking for down here?" "I wanted to learn about my family," Ivy answered, keeping her tone even. "About my mother." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a trap springing shut. "Curiosity is a fine thing," he said, walking toward her. "But some things are not meant to be known. Some secrets are buried for good reason." "Like the secret of who murdered my mother?" she asked, her voice sharp. She refused to give ground. Marcus paused. The smile on his face never wavered, but his eyes went dark. "Be careful, miss," he warned. "When you dig in the past, you can awaken things that are better left sleeping. There are monsters resting in the darkness. You should not wake them." They stood facing each other in the cramped, dusty space. Marcus then tilted his head, as if recalling something. "Oh, have you learned anything about the leather jacket?" Ivy froze. The leather jacket? She had only mentioned that detail to Damien, in the privacy of the restaurant on the night they first met. No one else was supposed to know. How could Marcus know? He seemed to sense his error. His smile became wider, smoother, a mask to hide the mistake. "Damien told me," he said with ease. "We keep no secrets from one another. I am his most trusted advisor, after all." "Yes." Ivy nodded, forcing her own smile. "I see." But inside her, a siren was screaming. Damien never would have shared that detail. Not with anyone. He was far too protective of her to reveal something so personal. Marcus knew about the jacket. He had asked if she had found anything. He had appeared just as she was starting her search. This was not a coincidence. "You need to return to your room and get some sleep," Marcus said, pulling the archive door open. "The hour is late. It is not good for you." Ivy walked out, feeling his stare like a physical weight on her back all the way down the hall. Once inside her room, she locked the door and sagged against it, her heart hammering. She was certain of one thing. Marcus Kane was not a good person. He was concealing a secret, and he was watching her. She had to locate the man in the leather jacket before he did. She could not wait another day. When the house fell silent at 1 in the morning, Ivy made her move. She slipped out of her nightgown and pulled on a pair of black jeans and a dark hoodie she had hidden deep in her closet. With her phone secure in a pocket and her sneakers laced tight, she went to the window. Her room was on the second floor, but a weathered trellis clung to the stone wall below. She had studied its strength for days, praying it would hold her. After opening the window and taking a single shaky breath, she climbed outside. The cold night air cut her skin. Her hands found their grip on the dry, old wood. Her feet searched for solid places to stand. Her heart pounded against her ribs, threatening to burst. A fall meant broken bones. Being discovered meant something worse, something she dared not imagine from Damien. But she had no other path. She had to learn the truth. She lowered her body down the wall, testing each branch to avoid a loud snap. When her feet finally touched the ground, she disappeared into the shadows to watch. A security camera swept across the yard. She waited for its lens to turn away, then she ran for the fence. The guards followed a predictable route she had secretly memorized all week. She knew she had 5 minutes before they passed the side gate. It was enough time. She climbed the fence where a thicket of trees offered cover. Branches tore at her clothes, but she ignored the damage. She followed a thin trail behind the estate until it met the main road, where she used an app to summon a car. The 10-minute wait felt like an eternity. When the yellow car finally appeared, she threw herself inside, as if escaping a fire. The South Industrial District, she told the driver. 30 minutes later, Damien concluded his meeting and came back to the estate. He went straight to Ivy's room to check on her, as he always did. But he found the door slightly open, and the room empty. The bed had not been slept in. The window was open, letting the wind whip the curtains. He stood frozen for a second, then two, before his control shattered. Damien spun and slammed his fist into the large mirror on the wall. Glass exploded everywhere. Blood streamed from his knuckles, but he felt no pain. He felt only a single cold emotion. Fear. The fear of losing her a second time. Just like he had 26 years ago. "Find her!" he yelled at the bodyguards who rushed in at the sound of the crash. "Tear this entire city apart if you have to. Do it now!" Marcus Kane materialized in the doorway, his expression full of concern. "What is wrong?" "She is gone," Damien bit out, his voice a low growl. Marcus gave a solemn nod. "Allow me to assist. My people are all over the city. We will locate her." Damien agreed, too consumed by worry to see the strange, cold light in Marcus's eyes. Marcus took out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and a faint smile touched his lips as Ivy's location appeared as a dot on the map. At that moment, Ivy was making her way through the old industrial zone on the south side. It was a place of abandoned factories, rusting garages, and run-down bars. She approached anyone she saw, asking the same questions. "Do you know an old mechanic? He wears a leather jacket, has an old motorcycle. He might have been around here about 26 years ago." Most people ignored her or waved her off. Some gave her looks as if she were insane. She was close to giving up when a drunk man outside a grimy bar slurred and grabbed her arm. "Leather jacket," he mumbled, his breath thick with liquor. "Old mechanic. You mean old Walt?" Ivy knelt in front of him. "You know where I can find him?" The man let out a wet laugh. "Everyone knows that crazy old fool lives under the East Bridge, completely mad. He talks all day about the little girl from the rainy night." The man shook his head. "Over 20 years, and he still goes on about it. He is absolutely nuts. The little girl from the rainy night." Ivy's heart seemed to stop beating. That was her. She was the little girl. She shot to her feet and ran for the East Bridge. Her legs flew across the pavement, her heart drumming against her ribs. She was so close to the truth. She was about to find out what truly happened that night 26 years ago. She had no idea that in the shadows behind her, a line of dark cars moved without a sound, tracking the signal from her phone. And the man leading them was not Damien. Under the East Bridge, it was another world. It was dark and damp, and the smell of rot and sewer water was so thick it coated her throat. The streetlights were dim, their glow reaching only a few feet. The rest was swallowed by a deep, oppressive blackness. Ivy walked forward, her shoes splashing in dirty puddles as her vision adjusted. She saw crude shelters made from cardboard and plastic sheets. Figures were huddled in the corners, some sleeping, others watching her with empty eyes. And then she saw him. A form curled up in the deepest corner under a cracked concrete ledge. His hair was a wild white mane falling to his shoulders. A thick beard covered most of his face. His clothes were shredded and filthy. But as Ivy got closer, she saw his eyes. They were still sharp, still bright. They held a spark that had not been extinguished by years of hardship. "Are you Walter Morris?" Ivy asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The man with the motorcycle and the leather jacket?" The old man jerked back, trying to disappear further into the shadows. "Who is asking?" he stammered, his voice raspy from disuse. "I have nothing. Leave me alone." Ivy took one more step. "I am not here to take anything from you. I came to learn what happened that night on Raven's Peak. The car that went off the cliff? The pregnant woman who was inside?" Old Walt became perfectly still. "What are you talking about?" Ivy moved closer, and the faint light from the street caught the golden token she wore around her neck. The pendant shone in the gloom like a tiny captured star. Old Walt's gaze locked onto it. His eyes grew wide, and his entire body started to tremble. Then he began to weep. Tears streamed down his weathered face, vanishing into his silver beard. "My little girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are alive. I have spent my whole life wondering if you lived or died. And now you are here. You are alive." A knot formed in Ivy's chest. "So it was you," she said softly. "You were the one who saved me that night." Old Walt nodded, still crying. He pulled her down to sit with him, his shaking, calloused hand finding hers. Then he began to speak, his voice low and heavy, an echo from a buried past. "That night I was riding my bike up Raven's Peak. The rain was a solid wall. I could hardly see anything. Then I saw them. Black cars flew past me, driving like madmen. They ran another car right off the road. I heard the sound of twisting metal, shattering glass, and a scream. Then the car disappeared over the side." He paused, his breath ragged. "The black cars just kept going. They never even slowed down. I was the only one there. I scrambled down the cliff, sliding on the wet dirt. The car was upside down and smoking. I saw her inside, Catherine. She was alive, covered in blood, but she was alive. And she was clutching her stomach, protecting the baby." "My mother," Ivy whispered, her own tears now falling freely. Old Walt nodded. "She looked right at me. Her eyes. I will never forget them. They were full of pain, but also fire. She grabbed my hand and said, 'Save my child. Please save my child.'" He wiped at his face, with the sleeve of his ripped coat. "Then your mother gave birth. She delivered you right there in the wreckage with her final ounce of strength. I helped bring you into the world. You were so tiny and new, your cries cutting through the rainy dark. She looked at you just one time. Then she removed her necklace and tied it around your neck. The knot was so tight I struggled to secure it. She whispered something in your ear. I heard her." "What did she say?" Ivy asked, her voice tight. Old Walt met her gaze, his own eyes sore and red. "She said to find your father. She said the token would guide you home. She told you to live for her." Ivy began to sob. She wept for a lifetime of not knowing her own mother. She cried for nearly 30 years of believing she had been abandoned. But it was not true. Her mother had fought for her life. Her mother had spent her final breath making sure she was safe. "And then she was gone," Old Walt continued, his words like a tired sigh. "She died right in my arms. I held you, and I watched her pass." "Why did you not call for help?" Ivy asked. "Why did you take me to an orphanage?" Old Walt lowered his head, full of shame. "I have a criminal record. I was terrified they would accuse me. I also knew the Mafia was involved. The cars had an emblem I recognized. Speaking up would have been a death sentence." He gently squeezed Ivy's hand. "I brought you to the orphanage, left you on the steps, and then I vanished. I have lived with that guilt and fear ever since. I am so sorry." Ivy put her arms around the old man. "My mother fought so I could live, she said through her tears. And you are the one who saved me. You have nothing to be sorry for. Just then, the squeal of tires tore through the quiet under the bridge. Ivy looked up to see Damon running toward them. His eyes were intense, his body coiled like a spring. But he stopped short when he saw her tears. He looked from old Walt to Ivy, and understanding dawned on his face. You were the one who saved her, Damon said in a quiet voice. Old Walt stood up, shaking. I am sorry. I should have come forward years ago. Damon had no chance to reply. A second pair of headlights blinded them, flooding the space beneath the bridge. This was not his car. A convoy of black vehicles slid to a halt. A man emerged from the shadows. It was Marcus Kane. He wore a cold smile. I finally found you, he said. All three of you. Damon reacted in an instant, moving to stand in front of Ivy while drawing his weapon in one smooth motion. Marcus's men were already fanning out, blocking every possible escape route. The headlights from their cars filled the underpass, casting long, menacing shadows on the concrete walls. Marcus, Damon growled. What is the meaning of this? Marcus's smile remained, the same one Ivy remembered from her first days at the estate. Now it seemed different, colder. I am looking for our young lady, Marcus answered softly. Just like you. I did not call for you, Damon said, his gun still aimed at Marcus. You did not have to, Marcus replied with a shrug. I know everything. It is my job. As your closest advisor, I have served the family for more than half my life. I know every move you make, every choice, every single weakness. The air grew heavy with unspoken threats. Ivy stood behind Damon, her hand gripping old Walt's trembling arm. Marcus let out a long sigh. The smile disappeared. His friendly disguise fell away, showing the man underneath. His face was cold, greedy, and filled with a deep hatred. What a pity, Marcus said, his voice stripped of its warmth. I had hoped the girl would never find this old man. Things would have been so much easier. She could have remained the family's clueless little princess, knowing and doing nothing. I would have continued to wait, but now she knows far too much. Damon pointed the gun directly at Marcus's forehead. What did you just say? Marcus looked at Damon with pure contempt. I have waited for 26 years, Damon. An entire lifetime. I thought the girl had died with her mother. The plan was perfect. Catherine dies. The baby dies. Victor shatters. The family would need a new leader. And that new leader was supposed to be me. You are a traitor, Ivy cried out, her voice shaking with both fury and horror. Marcus turned to face her. A traitor? He let out a chilling laugh. No, young lady. I am simply taking what is mine. Victor made me a promise. He promised me power, status, a real future. I was the one who helped him build this empire from nothing. Then he adopted a boy from the street. Marcus turned back to Damon, his eyes burning with resentment. After 26 years of loyalty and service, I was still just an advisor. But you, a child he found in the gutter, you became the boss. Can you imagine how that feels? Damon stood like a statue. He stared at the man he had trusted for 25 years. The man who taught him how to lead. The man who had been at his side for every major decision. You gave them Catherine's schedule, Damon said, his voice strained. Marcus nodded, showing no remorse. You are finally starting to understand. Yes. I sold them the information. I told them when she left the hospital, her travel route, how many guards she had, everything. Preston Cole paid me a great deal of money for it. Preston Cole, Damon repeated through clenched teeth. Oh, you did not know about that? Marcus laughed. Preston was the one who planned it all. I just supplied the necessary details. It was a flawless plan. Catherine dies. The baby dies. Victor falls apart. The family descends into chaos. Preston seizes control. And I receive the reward I have always deserved. Marcus took a breath. But then you showed up. An 11-year-old boy, kneeling before Victor and swearing an oath. Victor saw you as his salvation. He gave you everything, and I had to start waiting all over again. For 26 years, Damon, I have waited for you to fail. I have waited for you to die. I have waited for my chance. Marcus then looked at Ivy. And now this girl appears with the token, with her inheritance, destroying everything I have worked for. Marcus raised his own gun. This time, I will finish the job myself. No more mistakes. He aimed the weapon at old Walt. Kill the old man. He then swung it toward Ivy. Kill the girl. Finally, he looked at Damon. And as for you, you will die a traitor. I will tell everyone that you conspired with our enemies to steal Ashford assets. I will say that you killed Victor's daughter, and that I, the loyal advisor, avenged her by eliminating you. Old Walt stumbled backward, terrified. Please, sir, he pleaded. I am just a harmless old man. But Ivy stepped forward. She moved to stand in front of old Walt, her chin high, her eyes locked on Marcus. If you want to kill him, you have to kill me first. Marcus seemed surprised for a moment. Then he chuckled. So brave. Just like your mother. Catherine was brave too. She stared directly into the headlights of the cars that were coming for her. She never screamed. He aimed the gun at Ivy. As you wish, miss, Damon yelled. Marcus! The gunshot echoed through the night. Damon moved like lightning, lunging for Ivy. In a split second, he threw her to the ground, shielding her with his body. The bullet that was meant for her head tore through his left shoulder instead. Hot blood sprayed across Ivy's face. She let out a terrified scream, but Damon did not falter. He gritted his teeth against the searing pain, spun around, and fired back at Marcus. At that exact moment, more engines roared to life under the bridge. 3 more black cars sped into the underpass. They were Damon's men, the team that had been secretly following him. They jumped out of the cars with weapons drawn, and the area erupted in gunfire. The underpass became a war zone. The crack of gunshots was deafening. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark in violent bursts. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung thick in the air. Marcus's men returned fire wildly, but Damon's team was larger and more skilled. One by one, Marcus's men fell. Damon got to his feet, his left shoulder bleeding freely, but he fought as if he felt nothing. He moved like a shadow, taking down a man who was advancing on Ivy. Then he turned his attention back to Marcus. The rage in his eyes was a blazing fire. Old Walt pulled Ivy behind a concrete support, using his own body as a shield. A stray bullet grazed his leg, drawing blood, but he held on tight. "Stay down!" he yelled in her ear. "Do not look up!" Marcus took cover behind a car, firing back at Damon. "You were always Victor's loyal dog," he screamed above the chaos. "But a dog can never be the master. You will always be that kid he dragged out of the gutter." Damon neutralized another one of Marcus's men. "You are wrong," he replied, his voice like ice. "I am not loyal to Victor." He leaped over a steel drum, closing the gap between them. "My loyalty is to the Ashford family." Another shot rang out from his gun, and the last of Marcus's men dropped. Damon glanced toward Ivy. "She is the only Ashford left." Marcus was out of ammunition. He tossed his empty gun aside, drew a knife, and rushed at Damon. The 2 men collided like enraged beasts. Marcus lunged with the knife. Damon dodged, but the wound in his shoulder slowed him just enough. The blade sliced a deep gash along Damon's arm. More blood flowed, but Damon did not retreat. He landed a hard punch to Marcus's face, throwing him off balance. He followed with a kick to Marcus's knee, forcing him to the ground. A final, heavy punch to Marcus's temple ended the fight. Marcus collapsed, and the knife clattered across the concrete. Damon pinned him down, pressing the gun to his head, his finger resting on the trigger. Marcus lay on the ground, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, but he started to laugh. The unhinged sound echoed under the now silent bridge. "Go ahead, kill me," he taunted. "Kill me, Damon, and you will never learn who is really behind all of this." Preston Cole. Do you even know where he is? Do you have any idea what he is doing at this very moment? Damon froze. His finger remained on the trigger, but he hesitated. "Kill me, and you lose your only link to him," Marcus sneered. "But if you let me live, you might have a chance to uncover the whole truth." Damon ground his teeth in frustration. He wanted to end the traitor's life right there. But his mind stopped him. He needed Marcus alive. He needed the information. "Tie him up," Damon commanded. He issued a command to his men. "If he moves, shoot his leg." Ivy rushed to Damien's side. His blood was streaked across her face. Her eyes were swollen and red from terror. She saw the hole in his shoulder and the gash on his arm, and her knees felt weak. Her voice cracked. "You were shot because of me." But Damien ignored his own wounds. He raised a hand to her cheek, searching her face for any sign of injury. "Are you okay?" Ivy could only stare, completely shocked. "You are bleeding," she whispered. "A bullet just went through you, and you are asking if I am okay." Damien's dark eyes seemed to soften for a moment. His voice was raw with pain, but as solid as rock. "I told you. No one is allowed to touch you. No one." At that moment, Damien's phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out, and as he read the screen, all the color drained from his face. "What is it?" Ivy asked. Damien looked from her to Marcus, who was tied up on the floor. His voice was strained. "Victor is dying," he added, "and Preston Cole has called an emergency council meeting." Damien lunged down, grabbing Marcus by his collar and pulling him up. "Who is behind this?" he shouted. "Who paid you to betray Catherine?" Marcus coughed up a spray of blood onto the pavement, and then he laughed. It was the sound of a man with nothing left, holding one last piece of power. "Preston Cole," he snarled. "It was all him. He paid for it. He set it up. He has wanted to take over the Ashford family for 26 years. What else?" Damien's grip tightened. "Tell me everything you know." But Marcus just smiled and fell silent. His eyes were full of defiance. "You want the details? Then you have to let me live. I am the only person who can witness against him. Without me, you have no proof against Preston." Damien fought the urge to strike him, knowing Marcus was correct. He stood up and spoke to his men. "Tie him up and put him in one of the cars. If he makes a run for it, shoot him in the knees." The line of cars sped through the night, slicing through the Blackwood City darkness. Damien was in the back seat as one of his men applied a crude bandage to his shoulder. Blood immediately began to soak through the fabric. His face was white from blood loss, but his eyes were still lit with a fierce resolve. Ivy sat next to him, holding his hand tightly. "You have to go to a hospital," she pleaded, her voice choked with worry. "Later," Damien said without looking at her. "First Victor, then Preston. Preston is going to answer for what he did." At the same time, the Ashford estate was lit up against the night sky. The council chamber was ablaze with light. 10 of the family's most powerful members were seated at a long oak table. Every face was etched with worry and fear. Preston Cole stood at the head of the table, in the place that belonged to Damien. "This is a grave situation," Preston announced. His voice was low, filled with fake sincerity. "Victor is on his deathbed. The doctors do not expect him to survive the night. And Damien, our leader, is missing. No one can find him. No one can contact him." He scanned the faces around the table, making sure he held their attention. "The Ashford family has no heir of its own blood," Preston went on. "Catherine died 26 years ago, and her unborn child died with her. Damien is merely an adopted son. Family law gives him no right to inherit. And now, at the very moment of Victor's death, he has vanished. What do you suppose that means?" A nervous whisper spread through the room. Some of the members started to nod in agreement. "This family requires stability," Preston said firmly. "We need a leader with experience, someone who has been by Victor's side since the beginning. I suggest the council votes to strip Damien Blackwood of his title. We can appoint temporary leadership until this crisis is over." In another car, not far behind, Old Walt was being helped into clean clothes by an assistant. His injured leg was bandaged. He looked from his new clothes to the video screen on the phone, where Ivy was watching him. "I will be a witness," Old Walt said. His voice shook, but his mind was made up. "I will stand before them all and tell them what I saw that night. I have to do that for Catherine." "Are you not afraid?" Ivy asked. "These are dangerous men. Testifying against Preston could put your life at risk." Old Walt met her gaze through the screen. A fire he had not felt in 26 years lit up his old eyes. "I have been afraid for 26 years, little girl," he said. "For decades I lived in hiding like a scared animal, afraid of every shadow. I am done with that. It is time to do what is right." The cars came to a stop at the gates of the Ashford estate. The light in the council chamber still burned brightly. Damien looked out the window, then turned to Ivy. His face was pale, but his eyes were on fire. "Ready?" Ivy asked. Damien gave her hand a final squeeze before opening the car door. "Let's go," he said. "It is time to finish this." The doors to the council chamber crashed open with a deafening sound. The 10 highest-ranking members of the Ashford family turned in unison. At the head of the table, Preston Cole froze, the arrogant smile wiped from his face. Damien Blackwood walked in. His left shoulder was bandaged, but a terrifying red stain was already spreading across the white cloth. He was pale from blood loss, but his dark eyes burned intensely, but he was not alone. Ivy walked in with him. She was no longer the frightened cleaning girl from the restaurant. She wore a simple black dress she had quickly changed into. Her hair was pulled back, and her chin was held high. She looked like a different person. Around her neck, a golden token shone under the chandelier, a bright star in the darkness. "You wanted a blood heir," Damien announced, his voice filling the room. "Here she is, Rosalie Ashford, the only daughter of Victor and Catherine Ashford, and she is wearing the sacred token of the family." The room exploded in a chaos of voices. Council members stared at Ivy, at her necklace, and then back at each other, their faces filled with disbelief. Preston was the first to regain his composure. "That is absurd," he yelled, trying to be heard over the noise. "She is a fraud, a common cleaning girl with a fake piece of jewelry. Are you going to trust a liar?" Ivy took a step forward. She looked directly into Preston's eyes, her gaze unwavering. 26 years ago, you murdered my mother." A complete silence fell over the room. Preston's eyes went wide. "How dare you make such an accusation without proof? You assumed I was dead?" Ivy's voice was as cold as steel. "You thought the baby inside my mother died with her at the bottom of the cliff, but I survived, and I have a witness." The door opened one more time. Old Walt entered, limping from his leg wound, but he stood tall and proud. He was not the broken man from under the bridge. Dressed in clean clothes and filled with a new resolve, he looked prepared to confront the past. "My name is Walter Morris," he said, his voice ringing with clarity. 26 years ago, I was at Raven's Peak. I saw Catherine Ashford's car get pushed off the cliff. I climbed down to help her. I took the baby from her arms just before she passed away. And I saw who did it. There were black cars with a specific symbol on the doors. Old Walt raised his hand and pointed directly at Preston. "It was your symbol." Preston staggered back, his face turning pale. "This is just the rambling of a crazy old man," he stammered, his voice starting to tremble. "It proves nothing." Then 2 guards brought Marcus Kane into the room, his hands bound behind him. He looked at the expectant faces and knew there was no escape. "Speak," Damien commanded. "Tell the council exactly what you told me." Marcus took a long breath. "Preston Cole paid me for Catherine's entire schedule that night. The hospital departure time, her travel route, the guard count, everything. Preston paid men to run her car off the road. Preston needed Victor to break down so he could take over the Ashford family. 26 years ago, Preston Cole was the one who killed Catherine Ashford." Preston snapped. Marcus, he screamed, his face turning a deep red. You gave me your word you would never tell anyone. You promised. He stopped short, realizing his mistake. He had just confessed to everyone in the room. There was absolute silence. No one moved or made a sound. Damien walked toward Preston, his dark eyes like deep pools. 26 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. You stood by Victor and pretended to grieve. You saw him fall apart after losing his wife and child. You waited all this time for him to die so you could have it all. But you made one mistake. And Ashford is never truly gone. The council did not need much time. The decision was fast and unanimous. Preston Cole and Marcus Kane were cast out from the family to be judged by their laws, which was a death sentence. Then all eyes turned to Ivy. She moved to the head of the table where Preston had been standing. She faced the strangers who now looked to her. I did not grow up in your world, Ivy said. Her voice was soft but firm. I do not know your traditions or how to lead this family, but I understand justice, and I understand what family means. She glanced at Damien, who was leaning against a wall, exhausted but watching her intently. Damien Blackwood has protected this family for 19 years. He made a promise to my father as an 11-year-old boy, and he has kept it. He will remain its leader. As for me, I have much to learn. I will learn what it means to be a true Ashford, and I will never allow anyone to threaten my family again. Not ever. For a long moment, the room was quiet. Then, one after another, the council members stood. They bowed their heads to Ivy, to Rosalie Ashford, the lost princess who had finally returned home after 26 years. As soon as the meeting was over, Ivy ran to. She stumbled down the long corridor toward Victor's room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was dying. There was so little time left. She threw the door open and rushed to his side. Victor was lying on a large bed, covered in white sheets. His body was so frail it seemed to melt into the fabric. A heart monitor beeped a slow, steady rhythm beside him. In a corner, the doctor and nurses stood with grim expressions, shaking their heads. But as Ivy reached him, Victor's eyes opened. They were cloudy with age and illness, but suddenly became bright. He gave her the most peaceful smile she had ever seen. You succeeded, Victor whispered, his voice as faint as the wind. Ivy fell to her knees and clutched his wrinkled hand. Tears streamed down her face. Father, she said. It was the first time she had ever called anyone that, and truly meant it. Preston and Marcus have been captured. It is finished. Justice is served. Good. Victor gave a faint nod, his gaze locked on her. Good. He raised his other hand, trembling, and gently touched her cheek. You are just like your mother, he said, strong and beautiful. Catherine had that same look in her eyes, determined, unbreakable. Father, Ivy sobbed. 26 years, Victor continued, his voice like a long sigh. I have spent every single day since the accident believing you were gone. All this time, I lived with that regret. I thought I had lost my wife, my child, everything. I believed I would die alone, consumed by guilt. He paused, taking a difficult breath. But now I can join Catherine, he said, another smile appearing on his face. I can finally tell her. Tell her what? Ivy asked, her voice choked with emotion. That our daughter became a wonderful woman, Victor replied. That Catherine's sacrifice was not for nothing. That our Rosalie has finally come home. Damien walked into the room, stopping at the foot of the bed. He had a fresh bandage on his wound, but his face remained pale. He watched in silence as the man who raised him began to fade away. Damien's dark eyes slowly started to turn red. Victor saw him. My son, he called out. Damien moved to the bedside and stood next to Ivy. Father, he answered, his voice thick with emotion. Victor looked at him with pure love. I found you on the streets 26 years ago, he said, a thin, dirty boy with eyes full of anger at the world. I believed I was saving you, but you were the one who saved me. Father, Damien's voice broke. You rescued me from the darkness, Victor went on. After Catherine was gone, I wanted to die with her. I had nothing left to live for, but then you came into my life. You knelt before me and made a promise. You gave me a reason to keep fighting. You held this family together when I was too weak. You found Rosalie when I had lost all hope. He held out his hand and Damien took it. Victor now lay there, holding Ivy's hand in one and Damien's in the other. You are my son, Victor said, his voice firm despite his weakness. You have always been my son, not by blood, but by your heart. Damien lowered his head, his voice trembling. I will protect her, he vowed. I swear it on my life. Victor nodded, the peaceful smile never leaving his face. I know, I have always known. Even when you were just a boy, I knew you would honor your promise. He looked at them both, at Ivy and Damien, his two children. One by blood, one by heart, both his family. Live, Victor said, his voice becoming softer, as if it were dissolving. Live for one another. Live for this family. And be happy. Be happy for me. And for Catherine. Father, Ivy cried. Victor's eyes closed, but the smile remained. Catherine, he whispered, as if speaking to someone only he could see. I am coming. Wait for me. The heart monitor suddenly let out a single, long tone, showing a flat line on the screen. Victor Ashford was gone. He was calm and at peace. After more than 2 decades of painful waiting, he had finally met his daughter and reunited with his wife. Ivy collapsed onto the bed, her sobs filling the quiet room. Her cries were raw and full of despair. She had only just found her father, and now he was gone. Damien stood beside her, staring at Victor's serene face. And for the first time in 26 years, he wept. Tears rolled silently down his face, landing on the white sheets. He did not cry when he watched Catherine die. He did not cry through all the years of pain and duty, but he cried now. He reached out and gently brushed the tears from Ivy's cheeks. He waited for you, Damien said. He saw his daughter in the end. He died peacefully. Ivy looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. You lost your father, too. Damien gave a slight shake of his head. He is not gone, he said. He will live on in you and in me. He will be in everything we do from this day forward. The Ashford family cemetery was on a hill that overlooked Blackwood City. The sunset painted the sky in shades of red. The day's final light cast long shadows over the rows of white marble headstones. Victor Ashford's funeral was quiet and private. Only the family's inner circle attended. There were no reporters or strangers, only those who were family. Victor was buried next to Catherine. After a quarter of a century, they were finally together again. 2 graves stood side by side, their stone markers etched with names, dates, and a simple line below them. Forever together. Ivy stood before her parents' graves with Damien next to her. The evening wind rustled the white rose petals she had laid on Catherine's headstone. She looked at the stone, at the name of the woman who gave her life, who died so that she could live. Mother, Ivy whispered, her voice barely a sound. I am home. I found Father. I know everything now. I will live a life that honors your sacrifice. I promise. They stood there quietly for a long time. Then Damien asked, What will you do now? You have everything you wanted. Power, wealth, and family. You can do whatever you wish. Ivy turned to face him. I want to create a foundation, she said. For orphans. For children like I once was. For children who never know their parents. For children who spend their lives waiting for someone to come and take them home. She looked again at Catherine's grave. So no child ever has to wait almost 3 decades to have a family, she said. So no one has to feel as alone as I did. Damien watched her, his expression softening. The Catherine Foundation, he suggested. Ivy smiled. It was her first smile since Victor's death. The Catherine Foundation, she agreed. Old Walt stood nearby, dressed in the clean clothes Damien had provided for him. His leg wound had been properly treated. He was no longer the man from under the bridge. He had his dignity back. I kept my promise to Catherine, Old Walt said when Ivy approached him. She told me to save her child. And you are finally home. Ivy embraced him, hugging the man who had rescued her twice. Once from the car crash 26 years ago, and again when he found the strength to tell the truth. Thank you, she said, for all of it. Old Walt gently patted her back. I am leaving now, he told her. Mr. Damien found a small house for me outside the city. I will live out the rest of my life in peace there. You have earned your rest, Ivy said. Old Walt nodded, smiled, and turned to leave. His silhouette disappeared among the cemetery's trees. Now only Damien and Ivy remained before the two graves. The sun had set, and the sky had turned a deep purple. The first stars were beginning to shine. So what happens now? Ivy asked. Damien looked at her. Now we live, he replied. For Victor, for Catherine, and for us. Then she asked, her voice soft. Will you still stand guard outside my room every night? Damien looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were not cold or controlling. They held something warm and gentle. No, he said. Ivy looked at him, surprised. No. Damien moved closer. I will not stand outside your door anymore, he said, his voice low. I will be by your side, always, if you will let me. Ivy looked at him. The man who spent years searching for her. The man who had been wounded for her. The man who had kept his promise to her father since he was 11 years old. And she nodded. Damien raised his hand and placed it on her shoulder. It was a strong, protective touch, but for the first time, it was gentle. Ivy's fingers went to the token around her neck. It was the golden pendant her mother had given her in her final moments. Mother, she whispered, I am home. Damien stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They looked out at Blackwood City as its lights began to fill the night. The darkness was over. The guilty had been brought to justice. The truth was finally revealed. But in this world, darkness never truly goes away. There would be other challenges. New enemies would appear, and more secrets were still hidden. But now, Ivy would not have to face them by herself. The story of the lost princess and the Mafia boss is over. But its lesson will always remain. It is a lesson about a love that can overcome the passage of time. More than 2 decades of separation could not break the bonds of family. It is a lesson about loyalty. Damien dedicated his life to fulfilling a promise. Catherine gave her last breath to. It shows how a mother will always protect her child. This is also a lesson in courage when confronting the past. Old Walt lived with his fear for 26 years, but he chose to stand and speak the truth. Above all, this is a lesson in hope. It does not matter how dark your life becomes or how lost you feel. There is always a way to find your way home. If our story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel. Tap the like button and share this video so we can continue to bring you powerful stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of an experience in your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments. We truly want to hear what is in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a life full of joy and peace every single day. Thank you for being with us until the end. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.